we can solve the mystery beyond doubt of who this skeleton actually is. None other than Cleopatra's sister, Arsinoe, Egyptian rebel, Queen of Egypt.
For more than 2,000 years, Cleopatra has controlled the narrative. Rome tried to erase her. Historians tried to define her. Hollywood turned her into a fantasy. But her body, her biology, has remained silent. Until now. It's disturbing, because hidden beneath the gold, the power, and the legend is a genetic story so dark it forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about the last Queen of Egypt. This isn't about beauty or race. It's about survival, corruption, and a royal bloodline that may have been collapsing from the inside out. Martinez's revelation, the impossible geometry. For 2 millennia, Egypt's deserts have guarded a single maddening mystery, one that has taunted scholars and treasure hunters alike. The fate of the last pharaoh, Queen Cleopatra. Most historians have long insisted the answer is lost to time. They argue her tomb lies somewhere beneath modern Alexandria, swallowed by earthquakes, floods, and the sea itself. Gone forever. Case closed. Except one woman refused to accept that verdict. Her name is Kathleen Martinez, and she is anything but conventional. A criminal lawyer turned archaeologist from the Dominican Republic, Martinez didn't study Cleopatra as a distant historical figure. She treated her disappearance like an unsolved crime. To her, this wasn't mythology, it was a cold case, and every detail mattered. While scholars followed familiar theories, Martinez followed motive and behavior. Her investigation led her away from Alexandria, roughly 30 miles west, to a neglected and crumbling site known as Taposiris Magna. For years, the location seemed unremarkable, until it wasn't. In 2022, Martinez and her team uncovered something that defied expectations buried deep beneath the limestone. A vast underground tunnel. Not a passage, not a corridor. A colossal, deliberate construction carved straight through solid bedrock. The tunnel stretches more than 4,300 feet, nearly a mile, standing 6 feet tall, partially flooded with mud and seawater, and running directly toward the Mediterranean. Engineers and architects were stunned. Its precision and scale rival one of the greatest feats of ancient engineering, the Greek tunnel of Eupalinos. Experts began calling it a geometric miracle. And that raises the real question: why? Why would ancient builders carve a mile-long tunnel 40 feet underground through unstable stone? This was no small religious site, no minor outpost. Projects of this magnitude signal power, wealth, and extraordinary importance. The later discovery of a submerged port offshore only reinforced the idea that Taposiris Magna was once a major hub, not an isolated temple. Martinez believes this tunnel was never meant for water alone. She believes it leads somewhere final. Her theory is chilling in its simplicity. Cleopatra wasn't merely preparing for death, she was escaping Rome. She was determined to avoid the ultimate humiliation, being dragged through the streets in chains by Octavian. She intended to be buried alongside Mark Antony, transformed in death into the living image of the goddess Isis. And to protect that legacy, she needed a tomb beyond reach, hidden where no conqueror would think to look. If Martinez is right, this tunnel may be the entrance to that sanctuary. Cleopatra herself remains undiscovered, but the clues emerging from the earth suggest something far more unsettling. The last Queen of Egypt may have orchestrated the greatest disappearance in ancient history, and we may finally be standing at its threshold. Whispers of the Gilded Tongues. Deeper within the complex, Martinez's team made a discovery so unsettling it seemed to breathe life back into the dead. Hidden inside 16 tombs carved directly into the rock were mummies, but these were no ordinary burials. As archaeologists examined the eroded faces, something caught the light inside their mouths: gold. Where tongues should have been, thin amulets of gold foil had been carefully placed. In ancient Egyptian belief, entry into the afterlife was not automatic. The soul had to stand before Osiris, lord of the underworld, and speak in its own defense. A golden tongue was thought to grant the deceased the power of divine speech, what the ancients called golden eloquence, the ability to address a god without fear. But the question is unavoidable. Why here? Why at this temple, of all places? Martinez does not believe these were random nobles or forgotten elites. She believes they were Cleopatra's own people, members of her inner circle, her courtiers, those closest to her power. They were buried together, furnished with the means to speak before Osiris, perhaps not for themselves alone, but to proclaim the arrival of their queen. Consider the implication. This is no simple burial ground. This is not just a cemetery. This is a royal waiting chamber, a necropolis designed for a sovereign. And if her courtiers are already here, prepared, positioned, and waiting, then the queen herself cannot be far behind. Even so, Martinez remains just short of the final proof. Cleopatra's DNA is still beyond reach, sealed somewhere ahead. Yet while the world waits for the last barrier to be broken, there may already be another path to the truth. To glimpse Cleopatra's face, we may not need the tunnel at all. We may only need to examine the remains of the sister she ordered killed. Bloodline of betrayal. To understand the dead discovered at Taposiris Magna, we must first confront the true nature of the woman they served. History often paints Cleopatra as a temptress, but behind the legend was a dynasty built on paranoia, violence, and survival. Her world was not a royal court. It was a feeding frenzy. And her greatest danger did not come from Rome. It came from her own blood. Her name was Arsinoe IV, Cleopatra's younger sister, and her most dangerous rival. This was not sibling rivalry. It was a war of ambition. When Cleopatra was driven into exile, it was Arsinoe who seized the throne. When Julius Caesar entered Egypt, it was Arsinoe who rallied an army against him. She wasn't a pawn or a symbol. She was a commander. A teenage warrior queen who came terrifyingly close to defeating Caesar himself, trapping him inside the palace during the Alexandrian War. But history favors the survivors. Arsinoe was eventually captured and taken to Rome, where she was paraded in chains during Caesar's triumph. The sight shocked the crowd. A young girl, humiliated before the empire. Romans openly wept for her. That public sympathy spared her execution. Instead, she was sent into exile at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, in what is now modern-day Turkey. In 41 BCE, Cleopatra convinced Mark Antony to commit an act that stunned the ancient world. Assassins were sent directly to the temple. They dragged Arsinoe from its steps and murdered her in full view. Killing a woman was brutal. Killing her on holy ground was unforgivable. The scandal echoed across the Mediterranean. But that crime left behind something priceless: certainty. We knew exactly where Arsinoe died. For centuries, her body was thought lost, until the early 20th century, when archaeologists in Ephesus uncovered a strange, singular tomb known as the Octagon. Inside lay a skeleton belonging to a young individual. The age matched, the timing matched, the location matched. If those bones were Arsinoe's, then we had something extraordinary. We had Cleopatra's genetic mirror. Through her sister, scientists believed they could finally unlock the queen's biological secrets, her ancestry, her health, her lineage. It was the long-sought map to Cleopatra's DNA. But science has a habit of dismantling legends. Early DNA tests failed. The remains had been contaminated by decades of handling. Hope faded once again. Until, in a 2025 study, advanced forensic techniques finally produced results. And the answer they revealed wasn't just unexpected, it threatened to rewrite everything we thought we knew. The African question. To grasp why the 2025 findings sent shockwaves through the academic world, you have to understand the burden this single skeleton carried. This was never just about identifying Arsinoe. It was about redefining Cleopatra herself. The controversy began with the tomb. Its shape was unmistakable, an octagon. In the ancient world, geometry was never accidental. The eight-sided design echoed one of antiquity's most iconic structures, the Pharos Lighthouse of Alexandria. To archaeologists, that resemblance was not decorative symbolism, it was a statement of origin. German archaeologist Hilke Thür was the first to follow that trail. She argued that an octagonal tomb in Ephesus, the very city where Arsinoe was executed, was no coincidence. It was architectural DNA, a royal signature carved in stone, linking the tomb directly to Alexandria, and, by extension, to the Ptolemaic family. But the theory didn't stop with architecture. It moved into far more volatile territory: biology. The skull discovered in the tomb in 1929 lived a bizarre afterlife of its own. It was shipped to Germany, documented, photographed, measured, and then vanished during the Allied bombings of World War II. For decades, it was assumed destroyed. Then, in 2022, it resurfaced unexpectedly in the archives of the University of Vienna. Crucially, the skull's measurements had been recorded before it disappeared. Using those records, Thür made a claim that detonated across academia. She argued that the cranial proportions suggested the individual had an African mother. That single assertion lit the fuse. If Arsinoe had an African mother, and if she shared the same father as Cleopatra, then Cleopatra herself could not be described as purely Macedonian Greek. The Queen of Egypt might have been mixed race. The idea found fertile ground. For decades, scholars and writers such as J.A. Rogers and Cheikh Anta Diop had argued that Egyptian history had been systematically whitewashed, downplaying Africa's central role in its civilization. In the modern era, popular culture amplified the argument. A 2023 Netflix docudrama brought the debate into mainstream consciousness by casting a black actress as Cleopatra, reigniting global controversy. For supporters of a black Cleopatra, the Ephesus skeleton was the long-awaited proof, the only physical evidence capable of challenging the long-standing view that the Ptolemaic dynasty was an insular Greek ruling class obsessed with preserving its bloodline. But science has little patience for symbolism or ideology. The 2025 analysis didn't merely complicate the theory, it shattered it, dismantling the racial hypothesis piece by piece and leaving behind a far more uncomfortable truth than anyone had anticipated. The shattered reflection. For years, the skeleton buried in Ephesus served as our only reflection of Cleopatra's true face. Scholars gazed into those bones and believed they were seeing her sister. They believed they were glimpsing African ancestry. They believed the mystery had finally cracked. Then technology looked again, and the reflection broke. The turning point came in 2022, when researchers from the University of Vienna, led by anthropologist Gerhard Weber, rediscovered the skull that had vanished decades earlier. It wasn't lost to war or destruction after all. It had been quietly sitting in the university archives, overlooked for generations. That rediscovery changed everything. This time, the team didn't simply examine the skull, they penetrated it. Using micro-CT scanning, they produced an ultra-detailed digital reconstruction of the bone. More importantly, they sampled the petrous temporal bone, the densest structure in the human body. a biological vault capable of preserving DNA long after the rest of the skeleton has degraded. In January 2025, their findings were published in scientific reports, and what they revealed was not a revelation, it was a rupture. The DNA revealed a Y chromosome. The supposed sister of Cleopatra was, in fact, a boy, an adolescent between 11 and 14 years old. And his story was not one of royal rivalry, but of suffering. The scans exposed severe developmental abnormalities. His jaw was underdeveloped. His skull was twisted and asymmetrical. The evidence pointed to serious congenital disorders, conditions resembling Treacher-Collins syndrome or advanced rickets. This was not a healthy noble. This was a child whose body had been reshaped by genetic misfortune. And then came the final shock. His ancestry. His genetic markers did not trace back to Egypt at all. They pointed instead to Italy or Sardinia. The mystery didn't dissolve. It deepened. What we thought was a political murder turned out to be something else entirely. The octagon was not a princess's grave. It was a hero-on, a ceremonial tomb reserved for heroes or semi-divine figures. Why would a sickly, deformed boy from the Western Mediterranean be buried in one of the most prestigious monuments of the ancient world? Was he a scapegoat? A ritual offering? Or a hidden child of Roman and Ptolemaic blood, too dangerous, too shameful, or too politically volatile to acknowledge, yet too important to discard? Whatever the truth, one thing became undeniable. The so-called scientific proof of Cleopatra's African lineage tied to this tomb was an illusion, born from flawed methods and hopeful interpretation. So where does that leave us? Back where history always stood. Cleopatra was a product of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and to understand what she truly looked like, or who she truly was, we don't need her body. We need her family tree. And that tree is a nightmare. While the boy in Ephesus may have been a secret, the genetic catastrophe in Alexandria was policy. It had a name: pedigree collapse. In a normal family tree, ancestry fans outward. 2 parents become 4 grandparents, then 8 great-grandparents, branches spreading endlessly. But Cleopatra's lineage didn't expand. It folded inward. The Ptolemies were Greek rulers governing Egypt, obsessed with preserving absolute power and pure blood. To achieve that, they adopted the most extreme custom of the pharaohs: incest, not distant cousins, siblings. Cleopatra's parents, Ptolemy XII and Cleopatra V, were likely brother and sister. Her grandparents may have been uncle and niece, or siblings themselves. The dynasty was a closed genetic loop. Geneticists estimate Cleopatra's coefficient of inbreeding at over 45%. For context, the child of first cousins carries about 6%. Cleopatra's genetic burden was almost unimaginable. History offers grim parallels. The Spanish Habsburgs practiced the same kind of dynastic intermarriage, and the result was Charles II, known as the Bewitched. His body was a medical disaster. He couldn't speak until age 4. He couldn't walk until 8. His jaw was so malformed his teeth never met. He swallowed food whole. He suffered seizures, cognitive impairment, and extreme frailty. When he died at 38, his autopsy described a body without blood, a skull full of fluid, and a heart the size of a peppercorn. His coefficient of inbreeding was around 25%. Cleopatra's was nearly double. The biological explanation lies in homozygosity. Normally, your DNA is a balance, one parent's healthy genes masking the other's recessive flaws. Incest destroys that balance. Identical genes repeat identical errors. There is no backup, no correction. By every rule of biology, Cleopatra should have been physically and cognitively compromised, like the boy in Ephesus. But she wasn't. She was brilliant. She spoke 9 languages. She negotiated with Rome's most dangerous men. She ruled, commanded, and endured. Which raises the most unsettling question of all. Was Cleopatra a genetic miracle, an impossibly lucky outcome of a broken system? Or have we misunderstood her condition entirely? To answer that, we must look not at her but at those who came before her. Cleopatra's father, Ptolemy XII, was described as weak, lethargic, and physically soft. Again dismissed as moral failings, but medically suspicious. Modern medical historians now see a pattern running through the Ptolemaic line. Metabolic disorders, fibrotic organ damage, skeletal weakness, and signs consistent with Graves' disease, an autoimmune disorder of the thyroid. It causes goiters, bulging eyes, and, critically, behavioral changes. Graves' disease doesn't just alter the body, it alters the mind. It floods the system with thyroid hormones, producing manic energy, rapid speech, insomnia, impulsivity, and extreme risk-taking. Does that sound familiar? Cleopatra's boundless vitality has always been praised. Her tireless nights, her relentless momentum, her magnetic presence. But medical anthropologists are now asking a darker question. Was her legendary fire a symptom? Look at the coins minted during her reign. They show the Ptolemaic traits clearly. A hooked aquiline nose, a strong chin, a thick neck. This is not idealized beauty. It is resilience etched in silver. And beneath it all, the genetic bomb ticked. The dynasty suffered from bone density loss and jaw malformations, the same weaknesses seen in the boy from Ephesus. Obesity haunted the bloodline. Did Cleopatra inherit that tendency too? Some scholars suspect her famously petite frame wasn't natural grace, it was survival. If she carried the same metabolic curse as her uncle, her body may have been locked in constant conflict, with hyperthyroidism burning calories at a dangerous rate. Cleopatra may not have conquered genetics. She may have been racing against it. How did she escape? This is where the mystery fractures into 2 opposing explanations: the medical victim theory and the genetic miracle theory. The first argues that Cleopatra never truly escaped the consequences of Ptolemaic inbreeding. It suggests she avoided visible deformity, but not the hidden cost. And the most compelling evidence doesn't come from modern labs, it comes from the ancient historian Plutarch. Plutarch never uses medical language. He doesn't say growth restriction or developmental disorder. Instead, he leaves clues, small, almost casual details that modern medical anthropologists now see as diagnostic. The first is the famous carpet scene. Popular retellings show Cleopatra emerging from a Persian rug in dramatic fashion. But Plutarch is precise. She was smuggled into Julius Caesar's presence inside a bed sack, essentially a linen laundry bag, tied shut and carried on the back of a single servant, Apollodorus. Consider physics. For one man to carry her like a pack, she had to be extraordinarily light. Cleopatra was not a towering figure. She was small, remarkably so. The second clue is Plutarch's frank assessment of her appearance. In Life of Antony, he writes that her beauty was not in itself so remarkable. Her power, he insists, lay in her voice, her intelligence, and her presence, not in physical allure. When those observations are layered over a 45% coefficient of inbreeding, petite begins to resemble growth restriction rather than grace. Under this theory, Cleopatra's stature wasn't just a trait, it was a symptom. She may have been physically fragile, perhaps even fighting against a body predisposed to failure. Her brilliance, then, was not just talent, but adaptation, intellect compensating for physical vulnerability. The second theory moves in the opposite direction and is far more unsettling. In genetics, There is the concept of a statistical escape. Even with catastrophic inbreeding, it is possible, rare, but possible, to inherit a relatively clean combination of genes. A lucky roll of the biological dice. Look at the evidence. Cleopatra's siblings were weak or doomed. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, was a child ruler who drowned in the Nile. Arsinoe was captured and executed. The boy in Ephesus, once linked to her bloodline, was severely deformed. And yet Cleopatra lived to 39. She bore 4 children, proving fertility, usually the first casualty of inbred dynasties. She commanded fleets. She ruled. She endured. She may have been what geneticists call a mosaic survivor, someone who passed through a collapsing lineage untouched by its worst effects. While her family tree imploded, she somehow walked through the fire without being consumed. She inherited Greek intellect and Roman ruthlessness, but avoided the metabolic collapse of pot-bellied Ptolemy and the skeletal deformities seen in the octagon tomb. But biology always collects its debt. Even if Cleopatra escaped physical deformity, she may not have escaped neurological consequences. The manic energy, the sleepless nights, the extreme risk-taking, the paranoia, these may not have been personality quirks. They may have been psychological echoes of a brain shaped by centuries of incest. And here the story darkens. Whether Cleopatra was a miracle or a sufferer, she likely understood what was happening. She grew up watching her family decay, bodies failing, minds unraveling, siblings dying young. She saw the pattern, and that realization may reframe her entire life. Historians often say Cleopatra allied herself with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony purely for power, to secure Rome's armies. But what if she wanted something far more fundamental? What if she was searching for fresh DNA? By tradition, Cleopatra was married to her brothers, Ptolemy XIII and later Ptolemy XIV. She was expected to bear their children. She refused. She had no offspring with either of them. Instead, she turned outward, to Caesar, a man utterly unrelated to her. Then to Antony. What if those choices weren't just political strategy? What if they were a biological intervention? Cleopatra knew her bloodline was collapsing. She knew another generation of incest would produce children like the boy, buried in the octagon, broken before birth. By choosing Roman fathers for her children, she may have been attempting a genetic rescue, breaking the closed loop that had destroyed her ancestors. She wasn't just trying to hold on to power. She was trying to turn a collapsing funnel back into a tree. The pharmacologist, Queen. If we accept the idea that Cleopatra was a medical victim, a woman living with the physical consequences of extreme inbreeding, or the manic surges of Graves's disease, then we are forced to confront an almost impossible question. How did she function at all? How does someone command armies, negotiate with emperors, and dominate the political stage of the ancient world while her bones ache, her heart races, or her nervous system refuses to rest? The answer may lie in a role historians consistently underestimate, because Cleopatra was not only a queen, she was a pharmacologist. The famous story of the pearl is usually treated as an act of theatrical decadence. To win a wager with Mark Antony over who could host the most expensive banquet, Cleopatra removed a priceless pearl earring, dropped it into a cup of vinegar, waited for it to dissolve, and drank it. But viewed through a scientific lens, this wasn't spectacle. It was chemistry. Calcium carbonate, reacting with acetic acid. She understood reactions, dissolution, and transformation. And if she understood how to manipulate pearls, she almost certainly understood how to manipulate plants, resins, oils, and substances. If Cleopatra lived with the chronic joint and bone pain associated with pedigree collapse, the same kind of agony documented in other severely inbred royal dynasties, she would not have endured it passively. Egypt was the pharmaceutical capital of the ancient world, and she ruled it. If her body ached or weakened, she had access to opium harvested from the poppy fields of Thebes, the most powerful painkiller available in antiquity. It is entirely possible she used it carefully and strategically, not to escape reality, but simply to remain functional, to stand through endless diplomatic receptions, to sit in council, to appear strong when her body wanted to fail. If her suffering was neurological rather than skeletal, if she endured insomnia, agitation, and manic energy driven by a hyperactive thyroid, she had other tools. Kephi, a complex incense burned in temples at night, was specifically known for its sedative properties. Plutarch himself wrote that its scent lulled the mind to sleep and loosened the day's tension like a knot. For a woman possibly overwhelmed by relentless internal stimulation, Kephi would not have been ritual fragrance. It would have been treatment. Then there is the blue lotus, a mild, psychoactive flower often steeped in wine that produces euphoria and a floating sense of detachment. We often describe Cleopatra's charisma as supernatural, her presence as intoxicating. But what if part of that magnetism was pharmacological? What if her high-energy allure was supported by carefully dosed botanicals that softened pain, elevated mood, and allowed her to rise above the limitations of her own body? Her charisma may not have been effortless. It may have been engineered. And finally, there is her face. We know Cleopatra authored a cosmetic manual called Cosmeticon, fragments of which were later quoted by physicians like Galen. This alone tells us she wasn't merely applying makeup. She was studying it, testing it, refining it. If metabolic disorders caused skin problems, she formulated ointments. If thyroid disease caused neck swelling, she designed broad collars and elaborate jewelry to conceal it. If prominent eyes threatened her image, she mastered kohl to reshape perception. This was not vanity. It was camouflage. Cleopatra may have been the world's first biohacker, a brilliant woman trapped in a failing body who used chemistry, botany, and artistry to project the image of a living goddess while privately treating herself like a patient. If she spent years carefully painting a lie over her own face, she succeeded. Because she didn't just rule Egypt, she conquered memory itself. She ensured the monster hidden in her bloodline never surfaced, while the goddess endured. But 40 feet beneath the bedrock of the Mediterranean coast, Kathleen Martinez is approaching the one thing Cleopatra feared most: the removal of the paint. The tomb awaits. And so we return to where this story began, far below the sun-bleached ruins of Taposiris Magna, where dust, stone, and silence have guarded their secret for more than 2,000 years. Beneath that temple, Kathleen Martinez continues her relentless 20-year search for the last pharaoh of Egypt, guided not by legend, but by evidence. Thanks to the vast subterranean passage, the so-called geometric miracle, she now stands closer to Cleopatra than anyone in recorded history, closer than Roman conquerors, closer than medieval scholars, closer than every treasure hunter who ever dreamed of finding her. But after everything we now understand, the meaning of that discovery has fundamentally changed. At the beginning of this journey, we were chasing a myth. We were searching for the seductress who bent Rome to her will, the cinematic beauty immortalized by Elizabeth Taylor, the living incarnation of the goddess Isis. We were looking for a spectacle, for confirmation of a legend carefully polished by centuries of storytelling. Science, however, tells us to brace for something far more complicated and far more human. If Kathleen Martinez breaks through that final wall and reaches the sarcophagus, she may not uncover a flawless icon preserved in gold and incense. She may uncover a medical record written in bone and tissue. A woman who was small, perhaps physically fragile, who learned to mask pain with intellect, to counter weakness with strategy, and to fight the most powerful empire on Earth while quietly fighting a genetic war inside her own body. A ruler who survived, not because her body was strong, but because her mind was relentless. The implications of that discovery are staggering. Finding Cleopatra would not simply rewrite history textbooks, it would rewrite biology textbooks. It would force us to confront how power, intelligence, and resilience can emerge not in spite of physical limitation, but through it. And it would finally answer the question that has haunted this entire investigation. Was Cleopatra the genetic miracle who somehow escaped the curse of her bloodline, or the silent sufferer who ruled the ancient world while managing a body designed to betray her? For now, the tunnel remains sealed in darkness. The DNA sequencers sit idle, waiting for samples that may never come. And the ghost of the last pharaoh continues to guard her truth beneath layers of stone, water, and time. But one thing is already clear. The real Cleopatra, the woman behind the coins, the alliances, the wars, and the myths, is far more complex, far more unsettling, and far more extraordinary than the legend we fell in love with. And perhaps that was her final triumph. She didn't just outwit Rome, she outwitted history itself. And so the question remains, hanging in the air beneath Taposiris Magna. When the tomb finally opens, will we meet a goddess or a survivor? Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to click on the next video on your screen.